Today is Monday, May 12th, 2025. This is Quick Start from CBN News. I'm Dan Andros. A researcher looking for Noah's Ark breaks down some compelling evidence. We'll have that top story and more on today's podcast, where we bring you news from a Christian perspective. Don't forget to subscribe and leave a rating on your favorite podcast platform of choice. That really helps us out. You can email us your thoughts as well. Our email address is quickstartpodcast@cbn.org. Joining me to get through the news of the day here, CBN's Billy Hallowell. Billy, a lot to get to, as we always do, on the Monday episode of the Quick Start Podcast. On the focus story, as I just mentioned here, has Noah's Ark been found? A researcher's got some interesting theories.
Yeah, this is going to be an interesting one to dig into, and this particular researcher thinks he may have the location, so we'll be talking with him about it.
All right, looking forward to that coming up in just a minute. On the main thing, there are some interesting differences in reading proficiency across red and blue states after the nation's report card is out. CBN's Madison Seals has the details on that coming up on the main thing. Make sure you subscribe to all of our CBN News podcasts, including our latest podcast, Heaven Meets Earth, hosted by Abigail Robertson. New episodes drop on Mondays. You can check that out. The link's in the description of this podcast episode. With that, we are going to head to the news in 90 seconds. Now, the U.S. and China have agreed to reduce tariffs on each other for 90 days. Following trade talks, the White House says the U.S. will cut its tariffs on Chinese goods by 24 percentage points while keeping a base rate of 10%. China will do the same and also suspend its non-tariff countermeasures. Both countries plan to implement the changes by Wednesday. It's the first sign of easing tensions since President Trump reimposed aggressive trade measures back in April. And a new UK government report is drawing some backlash from Christian and disability rights groups after it estimated that legalizing assisted suicide for the terminally ill could save the National Health Service nearly $80 million a year. Critics say the report dangerously shifts the focus from care to cost cutting, creating financial incentives to end lives rather than to support them, especially for the disabled and mentally ill. The proposed law lacks safeguards for vulnerable individuals and allows assisted suicide for eligible pregnant women and doesn't require family notification. Faith-based institutions could also be forced to facilitate these deaths, raising serious concerns about religious freedoms. Those are just some of today's top headlines. You can check out those stories and more over at cbnnews.com. And Billy, we've seen, some disturbing evidences from the UK over the past few years about what could happen when you have the government running the healthcare. We've covered stories here a few years ago, Billy, recalling parents trying to get care for their young children who were ill, and the government wouldn't let them do it. They wouldn't let them try certain procedures and would rather just essentially give these kids end-of-life care without trying to save them. And these parents were desperate to just, hey, how come I can't just try this? I want to try this. What do I have to lose? And the government wouldn't let them do it. And the child ends up dying. We covered a couple of those, but seeing this, it's like a disturbing sort of reality that happens when the government gets involved here.
Yeah, and you have to wonder, all the arguments that have been made against universal health care over the years, this has always been a big concern, right? That if you have it and the government's controlling it, that when they see cost-cutting measures, that they may pursue those over the lives of people. And so when you have the government saying, well, if we did more of this doctor-assisted suicide, we'd be saving more money for the government, you have to be a little bit concerned about that, because again, we see this again and again with a lot of these issues. Oh, you're being a conspiracy theorist. Oh, you sound crazy. And then here we are with a report advocating that very thing. So yeah, it's disturbing, and really people's lives should come above money. I mean, hasn't that always been the entire argument for universal health care? Right. People's lives come before money. And then here we are now making arguments about cost savings and basically putting people to death.
Right. And they're essentially saying, well, you know what, if we just didn't have so many people around, boy, everything would be so much cheaper. It's sort of a dangerous line to go down, but it does. That's a great point, Billy, because that is sort of the big selling point for national health care. Is, well, I mean, it's prohibitive. People can't pay for these treatments. And then now you have the National Health Service turning around talking about how they can save millions. And, you put these people in promoting this idea that really devalues the human life and just sort of the value that we place as Christians on human beings that we've been made in the image of God. And when you boil people down to dollars and cents because, well, this is the greater good for the government. I mean, it's really a disturbing lack of regard for the value of the individual human life. And, even if you said, you know what, we wanted to put these things in here, which of course, just the idea of assisted suicide is controversial on its own. And Christians generally are not going to be for that. But even just the general idea of putting something in that's cutting costs across the board, at least if you have an option of not doing that as the individual where they can get out of it. I still think of those stories that we covered, Billy, and it's so disturbing to me when you see these people trapped in it and they have no options. That's where it gets really dangerous. The government's deciding life and death for you. And that is certainly a place that you don't want to be because it's the government's just never going to care for individuals like the family can, like husbands and wives can, parents and children. It's just never going to be the same. All right, we're going to...
And
oh, sorry.
Well, I'm just going to say one. Yeah, you gotta have a compassionate human faith approach to all of these things, right? And a practical one at the same time.
Absolutely. All right, we are going to head over to the focus story now. And as we mentioned there at the top, an independent researcher is speaking out about a place he believes could house the remains of Noah's Ark. So what's going on here? Why does he think this?
Yeah, his name is Andrew Jones. He runs this website, Noah's Ark Scans, and he's been getting a lot of attention in the New York Post. We've covered him, a lot of other outlets, because he's devoted his time to exploring this particular location near Mount Ararat that is believed by some to be housing these remains of Noah's Ark. And we had a chance to speak with him. And this Noah's Ark Scans, which he runs, it's sort of described as a loose organization of individuals who are interested in pursuing scientific work and promoting this particular site that is believed to be where Noah's Ark may have rested. And so we had a chance to chat with him about his own history. He's not an archaeologist. He is a layperson who has interest in this and spends a lot of time in the Middle East. He said he became interested in the Genesis flood story when he was a child, and that when he got to college, that intrigue really expanded when he went on a trip to Turkey and saw the location for himself. And ever since college, he's been going back and forth to that location, working on Noah's Ark scans and bringing scientists in to explore this area of Mount Ararat. Again, this is a site that a lot of people have looked at over the decades, and they've tried to take steps towards discerning whether or not this truly is that resting place. And so one of the reasons that Andrew Jones and his website have made a lot of progress, I think, in media is because they've done testing at the site. He said last year they did an Australian soil test, and they're looking to do more soil tests. But one of the things that they noticed in this area was that the grass growing inside this, what they call the boat formation, there's sort of this structure, and we'll talk about it after. It's sort of a shape that looks like it could be a massive vessel. That grass was different than the color seen outside of that boat object. And so local Turkish geologists, they sort of designed this test and got samples. And he said they found some really interesting results. So that is sort of just a little bit of background on what is driving Andrew's quest in this area.
That's super interesting. And so what's taking so long for him to research this area? Obviously a painstaking process here.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is one of the big questions people have. Like, if this is Noah's Ark site and people have been looking at it for decades, what is taking so long to get in and see? Like, is this just a formation that looks like a ship? Is it actually Noah's Ark? And he said, look, we're just as interested as anyone else in proving or disproving what this site is. He said there's a lot of factors. Some are political. This is Eastern Turkey. So you have issues there that you have to figure out. He said you have religious issues, right? That this is a story important to the Abrahamic faiths, but there are clearly issues when Christians and others are going in and trying to do this in an area that's not necessarily a Christian area. He didn't say that specifically, but I know that is something that has come up. And there are other issues, surrounding the science of it. There's a lot of competition, lack of interest among certain people, and other barriers. Yeah, he said, if you're going to pursue a scientific investigation to this site, you have to work with a local university, which means you have to find a university and professors who are actually willing to put their career on the line looking for Noah's Ark, right? He said, even for Islamic scholars, that can be problematic because people think you're crazy if you're on this quest to find Noah's Ark. And so all of that sort of comes together to create barriers, but yet, Jones said he and others, they continue to push on. They work with local authorities. They have international partners, and they've continued to try to do this testing, at the site. And, I'll mention too, Genesis 8:4, it doesn't really give us a ton of information. It says on the 17th day of the 7th month, the ark came to rest on the mountains of Ararat. And so, Jones basically said this isn't GPS specific. It's sort of like saying, if we're going to put it in the modern context, Noah's Ark landed in the mountains of Colorado or in the mountains of Canada. He said It's a general area. So it's not, so that makes this really hard as people debate these locations.
Why does he believe this is a good contender for the location?
Yeah, it's really, okay, one of the big things, it's the shape of the site. If you go back a few decades, it was in 1959 that there was actually a Turkish army captain who he saw this formation, this shape, and it piqued the interest of biblical scholars and geologists and made, apparently at the time, international attention. It was a giant boat shape that actually matches the biblical description of the shape, of the size, right? So that it goes back to 1959, and that's been an area of interest ever since then. And Andrew Jones said, it made a splash and people kind of forgot about it. And other people in the 1980s and 1990s, they started picking it up. This guy, Ronald Wyatt, he was an American. He started bringing more attention to that area after it had sort of been forgotten, and he has since passed away. But Jones and others have kind of picked up that mantle. But yeah, there are a number of things. Again, the shape, the biblical size, the location, and yeah, they're doing these tests right now that, again, like they did the soil test. They're focusing on non-destructive tests before they get into other tests. They're hoping to actually be able to do. They're not going to do a big archaeological dig, because once you start doing that, you start to potentially destroy what remains are there. But they want to do some other, like, I guess I don't know the exact term for it, but this digging that allows you to kind of get in and take samples underground. But they also think that they see, and this is kind of interesting, angular structures in a tunnel under this structure. Like they think that based on what they're seeing, that they actually, so they want to get in and look a little bit more at what is actually underground where this shape is.
Yeah, super interesting. And I wonder if they've considered, Billy, there's another spot that of interest. It's in Williamstown, Kentucky. And they got a big ark sitting right out there. No, but when you think about, if you've been to the Ark Encounter in Ken Ham's replica construction of what they believe Noah's Ark looked like, it's insane when you get there and you see just how large this thing really is. And so then when you it gives you a really good visual to go there. It's great place. But all that to say, when you think about, it gives you good perspective when you think about these guys looking for this and what it could potentially look like sitting there, if it's like relatively not intact, but like everything's kind of in a similar area. And as he's mentioning there, a rough shape of potentially a vessel, and it's ginormous. I mean, it's hard to put into words. You have not seen the Ark Encounter, and of course, it goes by as close as you can to the biblical measurements that are laid out in Scripture. And so, yeah, I mean, really an interesting thing to be trying to find this, and as they go forward and find these interesting evidences and research they're looking at. And I'll just say too that it's great when we find these evidences, but obviously whether it's found or not, it shouldn't impact your faith in one way or another. But it is one of these things that so many times we see it, Billy, that science ends up and these discoveries end up backing up what we see in Scripture.
Absolutely. And to your point, I mean, we don't need to find Noah's Ark to know that it happened, right? But I do think, can you imagine the headlines if Noah's Ark were found? I mean, my goodness.
It would be incredible. It'd be insane, but certainly keep us posted on the updates as they keep researching this. I appreciate you bringing that to the podcast today. All right, the nation's report card is out, and it's showing some pretty interesting and surprising differences in reading proficiency across red and blue states. Well, Helen Raleigh with the Federalist talked to Madison Seals about what could be behind this discrepancy. That conversation is today's main thing.
The National Center for Education Statistics released the results of the National Assessment of Educational Progress for the 2024 school year. Helen, can you talk about what the NAEP is and what age group and subjects it looks at more specifically?
Sure. So NAEP assessment is also called Nation's Report Card. They basically assess reading and math skills of Americans, fourth graders and eighth graders. So it focuses on reading and math. Basically, this assessment does is to evaluate Americans' kids in fourth graders and eighth graders as a benchmark to see if both the reading as well as the math skills reached a certain level. Because statistics speaking, kids who met those reading and math skill level, they're going to move forward and will have no problem to complete a high school, even later, finish college. But kids who did not pass those assessment level, then they really have hard time moving forward for the rest of their education. So these are the crucial age as well as a benchmark that the educators as well as policymakers are looking at.
You wrote an article about some of the main findings or statistics that stood out to you. Can you share a little bit more about what those are?
Sure. So what's really stood out for last year's is normally red states like Mississippi and Louisiana, they historically, they're poor, they rank at the bottom of those assessments. And the blue states such as California and New York are known scored on top of this assessment. But what happened was last year's nation's scorecard, Mississippi and Louisiana actually scored on top of this assessment, while blue states such as New York and California fell pretty significantly. And so this really stood out just based on a look at the data.
Yeah, and what is the secret of Mississippi and Louisiana's educational success, and why is that important?
It's really not secret, but let's just take Mississippi's example. So what's called the Mississippi Miracle is back in 2012, so a little over a decade ago, Mississippi governor as well as legislatures, they passed the education reform bill. Basically, what they did was, number one, they take students back to the basics. So they prioritize phonics, teaching kids how to sound the words out as a way of teaching them learning to read. And you and I assume we grow up in that kind of teaching environment. But over the years, especially in the last 2 decades, the progressive educators gradually abandoned that methodology. They moved to a different methodology called a whole language. So basically, they try to teach kids how to guess a word, try to guess from picture, from the context, instead of learning how to sound the word out. So Mississippi followed that methodology for a while, but in 2012, they went back to the basic. They went back to the trial and prove succeed methodology, which is going back to the phonics. Another thing Mississippi did that's very important is accountability. So basically, they have a retention policy for the third graders. If your reading skills and math skills did not meet the benchmark set by the nation's scorecard, then you cannot move forward. Then you're going to be held back until, you take the third grade for another year until you meet that requirement. Because I talked about earlier how important it is by the time you're fourth grade, you should be able to read and do math skills, meet that, because that's really will set up your, lifetime learning and education outcome as well as financial earning, whether you meet those benchmark or not. And the third thing that's also very important is the Mississippi State, the government invests in teachers training, and it's really not extremely costly. It's on average only $32 per student, but they invest in teachers training, they train reading coaches, and so they really, really put the investment down, but a targeted investment to help kids with with, targeted help from reading coaches to help them learn to read. So that's how Mississippi was able to improve from the 49th place in the union based on their reading and their math scores all the way to the top, number 1, number 2, based on adjusted demographic data from last year's scorecard.
Yeah, and those are such practical things, like you said, very tried and true, that, if a student isn't at the reading level that they should be or the proficiency that they should be at, that they don't continue to advance, because like you're saying, that's how you become a lifelong learner, is knowing how to read and to absorb what you're reading, to be able to keep learning even on your own outside of school. So what lessons should blue states take away from this report?
So there were a couple of lessons. Number 1 is the blue states always just throw money at the problem. Every time you talk about education outcome, they always say just throw money at it. Take Mississippi's case. Yes, Mississippi did put additional investment into teachers training, but the first 2 legs of the stool, in terms of going back to child and truth, methodology, teach kids phonics, as well as introducing accountability, those things do not cost money. Those things yield results. So the blue state needs to understand you can't just keep throwing money at the failed approach and expect the results going to be different this time. That's number 1. Number 2 is blue states need to, abandon, based on science. There are plenty of research shows phonics is a good, best way to teach kids, how to read. And the progressive, so-called whole language approach has been proven that, that doesn't work. And there are plenty of research showing that. So blue states need to follow that science and abandoning that, going back to the fundamentals, what works, teach kids what works. And I really want to emphasize that, because it's not just happening to kids anymore. The Free Press also have an article about it. There are 48 million American adults who grow up in the last 20 years. They cannot read either. They only read at the 3rd grade level or less, because they grow up through this progressive education methodology. So there are serious consequences. I really hope blue states will learn those lessons. Again, going back to fundamentals, do not use the fancy but ineffective methodology, and do not just keep throwing money at a problem, which we know there are many other ways can fix it.
Another important point that I just want to throw in there that you mentioned in your article is that this study adjusts for demographics. So it's not like we're looking at a lower class area in blue states and then maybe a more wealthy area in red states, and that could be the reason behind the discrepancy. That's right. Part of this as well, right?
Oh, yes. That's why I keep emphasizing the adjusted demographic, because we really compare apples to apples. So we compare kids from both blue state and the red state from similar social, economical, ethnic backgrounds. So this is an apple-to-apple comparison. You're absolutely right.
Do you think that the latest national scorecard on reading will prompt even the most loyal supporters of Democrats and teachers' unions to question more of these progressive education policies?
We see some spring shoots at it. So San Francisco Chronicle, which has been the most vocal supporters of every progressive policies, including education policy in California, probably since the beginning of time. Even San Francisco Chronicles commented about last year's nation scorecard to say what happened. It's embarrassing for progressive policies that we cannot, our kids do not read and do math, reach their supposed to reach the grade level. But unfortunately, the Democrats and the teachers union are hell-bent, not to change, because the Democrats last year, California Democrats last year killed a bill that it was supposed to bring more focus on phonics. And they basically killed the bill in a committee. The bill didn't even get a reading. And so that just shows you the Democrats and the teachers union are really bent to just keep doing the same thing over and over again, just keep throwing money at it. I hope something will change. So it's really forced to voters. Voters in blue states like California and New York, and especially if they are parents, they really need to take this to the ballot box. They really need to let the legislators, teachers union know that this is not acceptable. Their kids need to learn how to read and do math by the time they reach 4th grade and 8th grade.
All right, Madison, appreciate that conversation there. And that's going to leave us with time on this Monday edition of the Quick Start Podcast for one last thing.
We've got Psalm 44. Blessed is the one who trusts in the Lord, who does not look to the proud, to those who turn aside to false gods. We got to place our trust in God, where it really matters.
Yeah, and it's so easy. It is so easy to be prideful and to be drawn to those who are boastful and proud, but and really essentially even the modern day, what we would have as false idols. So trust in the Lord and keep looking to him. And great way to kick off the week with Psalm 40. All right. Head on over to cbnnews.com, faithwire.com for more news from a Christian perspective. Lord willing, that creek don't rise up on us. We'll be back tomorrow with more. God bless. See you then.